I find it hard to imagine what Vienna would have been like under siege. These days, trams speed around in the place where defensive walls once separated the city from the suburbs. Very few remains of what were huge defensive structures. In the places where the invading forces camped now stand apartment buildings. The U-Bahn cuts through the same ground where tunnels were once dug to plant explosives under the city's bastions, where now theatre houses stand. The idea of an army well over 100,000 men in size, marching from all over the Ottoman Empire to directly attack a Central European city intoxicates my imagination. How unbelievably strange and different was this reality? The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed IV became God's shadow on earth at the age of just 7 years. Being a minor, his shadow was of course rather short, so it was outshined by other members of the Topkapi palace. Mehmed's grandmother, Kusum Sultan, became regent after the young boy's enthronement in 1648. Mehmed's mother, Hatice Turhan Sultan, also gained considerable power but was sidelined by her grandmother's decades of political experience. A power struggle in Constantinople between mother and daughter and their respective supporters ensued. In 1651, palace guards who supported Mehmed's mother strangled his now 70-year-old grandmother to death. Hatice Turhan Sultan now served as regent. As Mehmed became an adult, he attempted to break free from the women regents and start making decisions for himself. In a different vein to other 17th century sultans, Mehmed IV pursued a policy of conquest with a strong Islamic zeal. Mehmed's initial jihad was successful in capturing the entire island of Crete in 1669, something that his father had failed to do. The Ottomans launched a number of campaigns into mainland Europe. Out of these campaigns, the Ottoman Empire expanded as far north as it ever would. In 1664, the Peace of Washvar had concluded the latest conflict between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. The Habsburger Leopold was initially intended for a life in the church, but as his elder brother Ferdinand died of smallpox when Leopold was just at the age of 14, Leopold took his brother's place in the imperial office. 3 years later, his father, Emperor Ferdinand III, died, and Leopold took his position at the age of 17 as Holy Roman Emperor. Leopold was a shy and indecisive character. Ill-suited for war, the Baroque emperor was musically gifted. He itemized every letter he dispatched and kept count of every penny he lost while playing cards. He married 3 times. Leopold's first wife was also his niece and cousin. After a short second marriage, Leopold remarried for the third and final time in 1676 to Eleonora Magdalena. His pomp Baroque court could not distract one's eye away from his classic Habsburg jaw and his general ugliness. Leopold was a Catholic hardliner and anti-Semite. Under his command, an attempt to evict all Jews from Vienna and Lower Austria took place. Leopold had 2 external enemies. To the west, Louis XIV was Leopold's rival. Leopold spent a large part of his reign forging alliances and fighting wars against the French. To the east was of course the Ottomans. By the 1680s, a change in political dynamic was reawakening the Ottoman interest in engaging the Habsburgers. Unlike many other sultans, Mehmed IV wanted to convert his subjects to Islam. Mehmed ordered the conversion of churches into mosques. This Islamic rhetoric, however, did not stop the Ottomans in supporting favourable Christian contingents. Following the decisive Ottoman victory at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 and the Ottoman occupation of Buda in 1541, the Kingdom of Hungary had been split into 3: Royal Hungary under Habsburg control, Ottoman Hungary subordinate to the Sultan, and the Principality of Transylvania, which would become an Ottoman vassal state. The frontier was subject to many wars. The previously mentioned Peace of Warsaw had followed an Ottoman defeat at St. Gotthard in Habsburg-controlled Hungary and secured the territorial status quo of the Habsburg and Ottoman territory within Hungary.
Following the peace, both the Habsburg and Ottomans turned their territorial ambitions elsewhere, but the Hungarian aristocracy themselves were far from content. For many Hungarians, it was seen as a betrayal from the Habsburgs. Many wanted to fight on, drive the Ottomans further south, and finally create an independent kingdom of Hungary again.
A large amount of the Hungarian nobility began to fear that the Habsburgs would continue to diminish their agency. These fears were valid.
Leopold took to a policy of forced Catholic conversion, sending Jesuit priests to drive Protestant pastors out of Hungary, which alienated the majority of Hungarians, even those who were loyal to him. The underground Hungarian movement, attempting to resist Habsburg control, which also had members within Austria as well, was no well-kept secret.
Emperor Leopold sent troops into Hungary to arrest the main leaders and swiftly execute them. Just like the Jews in Austria, he confiscated their property and wealth for his own benefit. Some did fall to the pressure and join the Catholic Church, but many fled to Transylvania where they could continue practicing their confession. Ottoman policy benefited and built upon the anti-Habsburg resentment that was growing out of Leopold's policies.
The ongoing struggle became shared with peasants and noblemen alike, linking them to a cause. By the 1670s, the anti-Habsburg insurgents had formed into a unified group known as the Kuruzuk. But who was going to lead them?
Emmerich Türken was a young man from a Protestant merchant family. Türken's father was killed by Habsburg forces at his own castle in 1670. The 13-year-old boy had fled the scene dressed as a peasant woman and escaped into Poland. This of course left a deep impression on the young man's soul. In exile, he met other immigrants and began to conspire against the Habsburgs.
He was clearly charismatic and determined, and he soon gained a following around him. While he couldn't hope to militarily defeat the Habsburgs, he was able to gain enough political power to represent a power base.
Fast forward to July of 1681, Türken sent a message to Constantinople and offered himself up as a vassal. It was at this time that the 20-year peace treaty of Warsaw was due to expire. It seemed like an opportune moment to strike the Habsburgs. With the young Hungarian leader Türken offering himself as a pro-Ottoman advocate and the hope of French interference in the West, the Ottomans rejected a Habsburg offer to extend the peace treaty.
As the Ottoman threat was growing, a partial religious freedom was granted in Habsburg Hungary in 1681. But it did not stop Türken in his raiding efforts. By October 1682, a lot of territory had fallen under Türken's control.
With this new gained territory, the Principality of Upper Hungary was created on the 19th of November 1682 with Türken as its prince. Kara Mustafa, the third Grand Vizier from the Krupulu clan, had been fixated on Vienna as the end game of gaining complete control over the European front. By autumn of 1682, the time had finally come. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa departed the capital of Constantinople and headed to Edina, where the attack force was to muster. On the 10th of February 1683, an Austrian envoy, Count Karl Ferdinand von Waldstein, arrived in Warsaw. His task was to close a defensive pact with Poland. The exact conditions were to be discussed over the following weeks. As always in diplomacy, both sides had conditions that needed to be negotiated on. The nuncio, Opisto Pallavicini, was the middleman in the Warsaw negotiations. The man representing the Papal States had only one goal: defense against the Islamic foe. On the 16th of March, 1:30 p.m., the Sejm unanimously approved a defensive pact between the Kingdom of Poland and the Habsburg Emperor. The day after this, the 17th of March, Sultan Mehmed IV entered the troop camp at Edina. Troops across all corners of the Ottoman Empire had been recruited, Syrian and Egyptian units being called up, alongside the Khan of the Crimean Khanate who brought his Tatar riders to the cause. At the beginning of spring, the Ottoman army began to march out of Edina. The Sultan accompanied his army until triumphantly entering Belgrade on the 3rd of May, but the Sultan would not march further. From this point, the campaign was in the hands of his Grand Vizier. The Hungarian Türken made his arrival in Belgrade riding at the tip of a 500-strong cavalry unit. He was received like royalty. War was still not declared on the Habsburgs, but the massive army was witnessed by Emperor Leopold's envoys to the Ottoman Empire, who described the immensity of it all in letters back to Vienna. On the 13th of May, the Sultan Mehmed IV handed over the banner of Muhammad to Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, promoting him to Serazker of the army. The newly promoted commander kissed the feet of the Sultan. A prayer was said, and according to eyewitnesses, Kara Mustafa began to cry. It was time for the battle against the infidels. On the 3rd of April, a man bade farewell to his wife and children, entered a wagon that swiftly departed the city of Innsbruck and was heading in the direction of Vienna. This man was Duke Charles V of Lorraine, the governor of Tyrol and commander-in-chief of the Habsburg field army. Charles was a veteran who fought at the Battle of St. Gotthard against the Ottomans. Although born in Vienna, his family's Duchy of Lorraine had fallen under French control in 1662. He had fought in the Franco-Dutch War as a captain in the Habsburg army and failed to claim his duchy back from French hands.
Charles was a loyal and exceptionally well-educated commander. He could speak multiple foreign languages without an effort. He enjoyed art, literature, and he lacked the common arrogance found in the upper members of the Habsburg court. For this, his troops respected him.
On the 8th of April, Charles was already in Vienna and invited to an audience with the emperor. He is briefed on the latest information and troop counts from the Hofkriegsrat. The Wiener Hofkriegsrat had a president who held strong influence over the emperor's decision-making during military campaigns. On the 20th of April, 3 ships from Steyr arrived in Vienna with more munitions. Some 2,000 iron cannonballs and 1,000 chain balls were part of the shipment. On the 6th of May, the Habsburg forces mustered on a field outside of Kitzi. 32,000 Imperial Habsburg soldiers, alongside 6,000 men under the Habsburg loyal Hungarian Count Paul Esterházy, were in formation.
While this Baroque army was considerably smaller than the Ottomans, it was highly trained and better disciplined than its feudal predecessors made up of mercenaries. Regular payments through the Habsburg finances allowed a modern military to develop. This was a professional, standing army with a loyal corps of officers at its head.
The majority of infantry still fought with the pike, but the use of the arquebus rifle had increased. With new formation tactics, on a good day, through changing lines, a battalion could provide a constant rain of fire on their enemy. The reliable flintlock musket rifle that can fire against wind and in rain, with a fixable bayonet attached on the outside of the barrel, was to be introduced over the decades following these events. Cavalry consisted of light and heavy riders, dragoons and cuirassiers. Dragoons were essentially mounted infantry, armed with a matchlock rifle and a sword, primarily did reconnaissance missions and was meant to constantly raid an opposing army throughout a campaign. The cuirassiers carried a broadsword and 2 pistols. Gone were the days of full body armor. The cuirassiers wore a helmet and a bulletproof cuirass to protect their chest and back. The cuirassiers were the battle cavalry, designed to charge in tight formation with cohesion and maneuverability.
In Kitzi, the emperor inspected the army with his commander-in-chief Charles at his side. The Empress Eleonora was carried behind them in a sedan chair for the 4-hour-long inspection. Afterwards, the commanders dined in tents full of pricey furniture. Laughs and jokes were exchanged alongside a 70-cannon volley to keep the men amused. The big presentations and music made it all seem like a game. Nobody really wanted to think that how in just a few weeks, the terror of war would upheave these lands. Despite all this ceremony, it was still not clear where to place the troops before the Ottomans arrived.
Charles wanted to take to the offensive. Ottoman held Esztergom or the Neuhauser fortress were the obvious targets. By pushing forward here, it would be possible to hold the Ottomans out until winter. The borders were to be reinforced with the Habsburg loyal counts Batthyány and Dracovic.
Emperor Leopold had no idea what was coming towards him. He believed in a manageable war far off in the borderlands, and that his army would keep the enemy away from his Austrian lands. The idea that they would fight it out in some fortress and forge a new treaty suited the imagination of the emperor. Either way, the plan to engage Ottoman-held territory before the enemy could arrive was delayed, as some of the essential heavy artillery needed for a siege had painstakingly been forgotten about and was still sitting in the arsenal in Vienna. On the 14th of May, Charles sent a message to bring the needed artillery in the fastest possible manner.
On the 24th, the offensive army led by Charles had reached the bridge of Comoron. Ottoman scouts were spotted from the Habsburg army's camp. On the morning of the next day, the heavy artillery forgot in Vienna finally caught up with the army. The little grass for horses or wood for the campfires put Charles in an unfavourable position. But it was here that Charles made the decision to march towards the enemy-held fortress in Esztergom. Hundreds of kilometres to the south, the Ottoman forces were camping in the area of Sirmia. Rain had fallen so strongly that all tents were drenched inside out. One of the Agas was struck by lightning while trying to recapture some escaping cattle. On the 31st of May, Charles received false information about the speed and position of the Ottoman forces. If the Ottomans advanced too quickly, Charles' entire army could be cut off and surrounded, leaving Vienna totally exposed. The information had overpredicted the speed of the core of the Ottoman forces. The heavy rain had indeed slowed them down, but nevertheless, Charles had disengaged the march on Esztergom and pulled his forces back westwards. On the 2nd of June, the Ottomans reached the bridge over the Drava River at Osijek. A large field near the bridge offered a perfect camping location. A troop parade took place. Kara Mustafa, watching from his tent, could observe the unstoppable power of the Sublime Porte. The army of 1863 was made up of different groups with moving pieces. I have condensed them into 3 sections. Firstly, there was the regular standing army, paid for by the Ottoman Empire, known as the Kapukulu. The Kapukulu included the elite Janissary infantry, Sipahi cavalry, and Topçu artillery. Then there were separate irregular troop forces provided by the border provinces known as Serhad Kulu and Yerli Kulu. The various troops in these groups belonged to their respective provinces or governors within the Ottoman Empire. These troops made up a large portion of the Ottoman army. Lastly were the auxiliary forces from the vassals of the Sultan. In this army, that was the Crimean Tatars, Moldavians, Wallachians, Transylvanians and Hungarians. That means this army saw soldiers and nobles from the Christian and Islamic faith working side by side. On the 3rd of July, Charles' army had reached their secondary target, Neuhausen.
The next day saw the siege begin, trenches being dug and artillery put in its place. By the 6th of July, Neuhausen was completely surrounded. Everything was going to plan.
As the artillery striked, a letter from the emperor arrived. Leopold, influenced by the president of the Hofkriegsrat, expressed his doubts about the siege. The army should not take unnecessary losses as it was essential to defend the Habsburg hereditary lands.
The letter was not written as a command and therefore it totally confused Charles. In the end, he interpreted the letter literally. The siege of Neuhausen was called off after just 3 days.
Charles led his troops back over the Comoron Bridge and into Habsburg-controlled Hungary without achieving anything. Obviously, this pointless marching back and forth had cost the troops and their horses considerable energy.
On the 11th, Charles received yet another letter from the emperor saying that the protection of Austria is the most important objective, but that he is allowed to continue the siege at Neuhausen if he sees it fit. Of course, the letter came far too late, the siege having already been called off. The miscommunication, interference and lack of strategy meant Charles now had no time. He was forced to adopt a defensive strategy.
On the 14th of June, the leader of the Kurultuk, Tukuli, sent an open letter to all of Hungary. All cities and nobles should submit themselves to his command. Now was the time for the final strike towards the Catholic Habsburger oppressors. The Hungarian counts Bácsony and Drakovic, who had until this point worked with the Habsburgs and in charge of helping with the border defense, switched sides and submitted themselves to Tukuli's cause. From this point, Tukuli would assist the Ottoman invasion materially from inside of Hungary. He would not engage in the siege of Vienna. On the 20th of June, the Ottoman army had reached Mohacs. On the 25th, they reached Siegerfehera. It was only here that Kara Mustafa and his entourage decided that they should aim straight for Vienna. Until now, it had been heavily discussed and obsessed about, but now it was a fixed objective. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold sought to solve the looming threat by ordering a 40-hour prayer session in Vienna. The Türkenglocke were to be rung out, to the sound of which all were to fall to their knees and pray. On the 30th of June, the first skirmishes with the Ottoman forces took place at Habsburg forward outposts. By the 1st of July, the enemy had truly shown up. Kara Mustafa ordered some 20,000 men under the command of the Bey of Buda, Ibrahim Pasha, to stay behind. The rest of the force marched onwards.
Many forward positions were abandoned without a fight due to the size of the incoming force, leaving the surrounding villages to fall to the Ottomans, their inhabitants to be enslaved or killed. The line had fallen and nobody had even fought for it.
Charles began to pull out in the evening of the 1st of July. In Gier, he left some 13 companies behind to defend its critical position. The next day, news reached Vienna that 40,000 Tatars had crossed into Habsburg lands. A ship reached Vienna supplying the city with 26,000 grenades. Work on the defences were being carried out with utmost speed. On the 4th, Charles and his army were still waiting to react based on the movements of the enemy. At this point, they still did not know where the enemy would engage.
Undeterred from this building tension, on the 6th of July, the emperor kept to a planned hunting trip just outside of Vienna.
On the 7th of July, Charles received news that the enemy had crossed the Leiter River. It was finally clear that Kara Mustafa's target was Vienna. Charles began to pull his troops back and sent out orders for other units to do the same. A section of his army were engaged by Tatar riders at Petronol. They were repelled, but at the cost of 300 men.
The news of this unfavourable battle sent Vienna into hysteria. The emperor finally now admitted to the danger. At 8 p.m, the emperor and empress, alongside a large portion of the Viennese court, fled Vienna.
By the 8th, Charles had moved his army onto the Prater Insel.
As the Ottoman forces moved closer to their target, the villages on the way, whose Christian infidel inhabitants were to be enslaved or murdered, were also set aflame.
52 people who took refuge at the monastery of Münchhof were slaughtered, and the monastery was then burnt to the ground. Just south, the Tatars at Frauenkirchen had met spiritual resistance.
As the Tatars were approaching the monastery in Frauenkirchen, two of the fathers had wedged a large crucifix against the door of the monastery in hope to repel the incoming raiders. As the Tatars broke in, they were both beaten and then enslaved. The many women hiding in the monastery were abused, raped, and mutilated. One woman met her death only after being abused from 17 different men.
On the other side of the Neusiedler Sea, the Habsburg loyal Hungarian Prince Paul Esterházy was holding out with just some 500 men at Breitenbrunn.
His forces were soon overrun and the enemy stormed into the village. The town church was set ablaze. While this happened, the priest of Breitenbrunn fled into the forests and managed to stay hidden for 2.5 months. When he returned, he recorded what he had witnessed in the parish register.
On the 9th of July, a group of Tatars and Hungarians invaded the town of Podersdorf.
The defenders had to pull back into the church. The men were armed with farming tools. As the enemy broke into the church, a Kurzuk line formed and shot the defenders with their muskets. Bodies fell, but 19 people managed to climb up the church tower and lock themselves there. Straw and reed was collected from the village surroundings and stuffed into the church walls. With a spark, the church was engulfed in a flame. With nowhere to run, the 19 people holding out in the church tower were burnt alive.
On the 11th, troops of the Ottoman army climbed the walls of Hainburg, a place where many refugees from the area had fled. Thousands were killed or taken prisoner. The sources give the number as 8,432 people. By sundown, the city was aflame. On the 13th of July, the bulk of the Ottoman forces had reached Schwekat. Kara Mustafa, now just 11 kilometers away from the Golden Apple, rode out further towards the city, accompanied by 10,000 horsemen.
Emperor Leopold's departure of the city a week ago now only added to the apocalyptic-like mood of panic and rage that was feverishly spreading throughout the city's population.
60,000 people, including those who had fled from the surrounding countryside, were now inside the city walls. Plumes of smoke were rising from the surrounding countryside. The commander Charles had only left 11,000 soldiers to defend the city. On the 14th of July, a final shipment of ammunition from Linz arrived on boat. Charles then led his army in the direction of Krems to secure a position from which a relief force can be mustered to strike the besieging Ottomans. It was vital that the bridges to the north of Vienna were held onto so reinforcements could make it back to the city in time.
In keeping tradition, a messenger of the Sublime Porte rode up to Vienna's city walls and demanded the handing over of the city. Vienna let the message stay unanswered, and so the siege would begin.
Vienna's defense was led by Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Starhemberg, like Charles, was a veteran from the Battle of St. Gotthard against the Ottomans and had also fought in the Franco-Dutch War.
Altogether, Starhemberg had only about 11,000 men, made up of the Habsburg army, the Stadtgardier, and some armed students. He was facing around 90,000 attackers.
One of the advantages Vienna had was its defences. The wall had mighty bastions connected by curtain walls. Ravelins in the ditch in front of the bastions would have to be bypassed in order to attack the curtain walls themselves. Starhemberg placed 1,000 men on the position of the wall between the Löwel and Berg bastion. It was here that he rightly predicted the Ottomans would attack. An additional 1,000 men were set up around the other areas of the wall, but the remainder of the force were kept off the wall as reserves. At 2 in the afternoon on the 14th, a fire broke out near the Schottentor. Nearby lay a large storage building full of gunpowder. It was at risk of catching light and exploding. The designated firefighters only found the courage to fight the blaze after the use of force was imposed on them by their superiors. With the fire under control, Starhemberg ordered all wooden roofs to be dismantled and to keep buckets of water at the ready in all buildings. And it was a good thing he did this too, because the city's water supply was soon to be cut by the sieging force. At sunrise on the 15th of July, the Ottoman cannons fired on Vienna for the first time since 1529. Starhemberg himself took a stone to the head on this day and was bedbound. On the 16th of July, our Ottoman general, Küçük Hasan Pasha, was hit by a cannonball while sitting in his tent. He died from the wounds in a matter of hours. On the 17th, the city was fully cut off from the outside world as the Prater Insel and Leopoldstadt were now controlled by the Ottomans. It was imperative for the city to receive reinforcements within 2 months, as that's how much time their supply of gunpowder and food would last.
Panic now reached an all-time high. Starhemberg had a hard time keeping things under control, and mob violence broke out as many falsely suspected spies, usually of foreign appearance and tongue, were murdered in cold blood. The situation, however, somewhat stabilized as Vienna's artillery proved powerful enough to answer the somewhat 300-strong artillery of the Ottoman forces. Also, some counterattacks outside the city walls showed that it was possible to clear out the forward Ottoman trenches.
On the evening of the 20th of July, a Habsburg soldier swam across the Danube, slipped past the Ottoman positions and arrived in Vienna. The messenger had a letter sealed in a watertight pig's bladder. It was from Commander Charles, and it promised the quickest possible relief to be sent. Starhemberg wrote an answer, ensuring that the city will hold until the last man. The messenger attempted to cross back the next morning, but was caught by the enemy. On that same day, a Bosnian writer and poet, Ibrahim ibn Ramazan, had his right foot torn from his ankle as a cannonball ripped through his tent while he was sitting down. He died from the wounds 2 days later.
In its second week, the siege entered a new dimension.
Since the beginning of the siege, Ottoman engineers had been digging tunnels to reach underneath Vienna's defences. On the 23rd of July, they had dug far enough to strike. Explosives were placed at the end of 2 tunnels and detonated. The explosions were followed by an immediate Ottoman charge, whose goal was to reach the craters created by the explosion and dig in as quickly as possible. In the meantime, the bulk of the Ottoman forces would move their positions forward and adjust their artillery positions. This would be the continued strategy around the Burg and Löwel bastion for the remainder of the siege.
Some inside Vienna attempted to flee without permission. Starhemberg acted on this and issued a decree that anyone caught attempting to flee would be hung on the spot. 3 gallows were set up in the streets of Vienna to make the message clear.
Transports of food for the Ottomans were being sent from Western Hungary. Despite a strong ban on alcohol, the Turkish companies began to drink wine and beer that had been scavenged from the area.
A commissioner of Dukuli, Ferenc Bakotzi, inspected the camp and discovered that his fellow Hungarians had drunk themselves unconscious alongside the Turks in a brotherly fashion. Some 400 barrels of wine were emptied under his command. Anyone who tried to replace this supply would be hung on the spot.
The Ottomans continued to pound the area between the Burg and Löwel bastions, including the Ravelin in the middle of them. On the 30th of July, Starhemberg was forced to pull his artillery off of the Löwel bastion due to the sustained fire it had taken.
Heavy losses were taken over the first week of August. The leader Starhemberg, like so many others, was suffering from dysentery.
On the 8th of August, Michael Gregorowitz, a Serb who served in the Habsburg army, left Vienna with 3 letters for Commander Charles. Dressed in Turkish clothing, he actually managed to slip right through the Ottoman lines. At around 3 p.m. on the 10th of August, a 15-year-old boy was caught spying within the city walls, counting the amount of cannons and collecting information. It turns out he had been kicked out of his master's house in Vienna, was captured by the Ottomans, and had converted to Islam during the siege. The boy was sentenced to death and decapitated some days later. On the 12th of August, another mine exploded underneath the Ravelin between the Burg and Löwel bastions. The next day, heavy rain led the cannons to cease firing on both sides. Just after 10 a.m., the merchant Georg Franz Kosicki, along with his valet, fled the city wearing Turkish clothes, bearing letters for Charles. In the night of the 14th, they reached the Habsburg camp in Stammersdorf. A big fire was lit to signal to the observation post on the south tower of St. Stephan's Cathedral in Vienna that the messages had arrived.
On the 17th of August, Johann Adam Lott, the commander of a 155-man regiment made up of Vienna's bakers, died in the fighting. Just one name out of many thousands who fell in the bloodshed of this siege.
The struggle for the Ravelin between the Burg and Löwel bastions continued. On the 24th of August, more mines were detonated. It was starting to really take a toll out on the defenders. The craters from the explosions gave more and more cover for the Ottoman advance, thus more counterattacks were needed to clear them out, leading to heavier casualties. Kur Hussein Pasha, the Beylerbey from Erlau, had orders to take 6,000 men from the Hungarian unit and support the area north of Vienna. On the 24th of August, he had just ordered his men to set up camp at the foot of the Bisamberg. 3 Habsburg cavalry regiments and some Polish cavalry, some 12,000 riders, were ordered by Charles to make for the Ottoman camp. By 6 p.m, both armies were ready to engage. The Pasha ordered to strike despite being vastly outnumbered. The Ottoman forces were absolutely crushed. 36 rockets were fired from the south tower of the Stephans Cathedral on the night of the 27th of August to signal to Charles that the city could not hold much longer. The deciding phase of the battle was nearing. Heavy rain overnight meant that all Ottoman trenches were muddy on the next day. Fighting picked up in the afternoon. Between 4 and 5 p.m, a mine exploded underneath the Burg Ravelin. The fall of the Ravelin seemed near, but the battle for it continued on. On the 30th, its intensity picked up, the Ottomans sending 3 waves of attacks. They were all repelled. By the last week of August, supplies in Vienna were running out. Horses, donkeys, and cats were being eaten. But for those who could not afford these fresher varieties, there was still plenty of spoiled beef to go around. Since the first week of the siege, armies that had organized contracts and alliances with Vienna had begun marching south. On the 31st of August, the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski III, and the commander of the Habsburg army, Charles V of Lorraine, united in Oberhollenborn, roughly 50 kilometers north of Vienna. Sobieski and Charles had in fact been rivals just a decade ago when both of them attempted to become King of Poland. However, the two men now acted with mutual compassion and respect for one another.
That night, Charles and Sobieski rode through the camp with the relief force. They were very pleased with the strength of their army. The successful battle a week before had provided much needed morale for the troops.
Sobieski wrote about Charles in a letter to his wife that evening in excruciating detail. Just one section reads, "His discourse is very good. Whatever subject one engages him in, Modest, not very talkative, and he indeed seems to be an honourable man. He also understands warfare very well and devotes himself to it. His blonde wig is quite ordinary. It is obvious that he does not concern himself with clothing at all. All in all, he is a person with whom my imagination readily agrees, and who is worthy of a far greater fortune.
Command of the relief force was given to the Polish king Sobieski. Charles did, however, develop the strategy of attack.
By the end of August, the combined forces of Franconia and Saxony had crossed the Danube in Krems, meeting up with the 10,000 strong forces of Bavaria and Salzburg. These forces of the Holy Roman Empire then marched east to finally form into one army under Sobieski. The brutal struggle over the Burg Ravelin was ended on the 2nd of September when the Viennese abandoned the now ruined defensive structure. The next day, a huge explosion erupted at 3 p.m. underneath the Burg Bastion. It breached a gap in the wall 9 meters wide. The Ottomans stormed it with around 3,500 men. After 1.5 hours of brutal close quarters fighting, the Ottomans were repelled, but things were now dire.
This was a low point. Viennese losses were high from all the fighting and illness spreading. Only about a third of the defending forces, some 4,000 men, still stood.
On the 6th of September, 3 mines were exploded under the Louvre Bastion, which opened a gap in the wall. Again, the attackers charged the gap. After hours of fighting, the defenders once again repelled the enemy. The relief force took a number of days to cross the Danube due to their size and a bridge having been heavily damaged. On the 7th of September, 600 dragoons reached the peak of the hills that overlook Vienna. They lit a large fire to show to the defenders that help was on the way. By the 9th of September, all Allied forces had united on the field on the other side of the hills overlooking Vienna, and set off on the same day in 3 columns in the direction of Vienna. The Poles under Sobieski, the Saxons under Prince-Elector George III of Saxony, multiple units of Bavarian and Franconian troops under Louis von Baden, Maximilian Emanuel of Bavaria, and George Friedrich von Waldeck. These armies, including the Habsburg army under Charles, was around 70,000 soldiers strong. Although Kara Mustafa knew about the relief force's location, he did not take much action until the troops actually showed up on the hills. He had, however, ordered the reserves under the Bey of Buda, Ibrahim Pasha, to march from his position on the border of Austria to come support Vienna. These additional 20,000 troops arrived on the 8th of September. Ibrahim Pasha took his troops to the foot of the Kahlenberg and set up defensive positions. Abazar Hussein Pasha was ordered to take his forces and defend the line at Weinhaus Otterking Baumgarten. The command of the centre was taken by Kara Mustafa himself. An Ottoman field post in the ruins of the Kamaldasi monastery up on top of the Kahlenberg was engaged on the night of the 11th of September. The relief force was now reaching the peak of the hills. During this night, artillery positions were set up all across the hills.
On the 12th of September, a fine autumn Sunday broke over the hills and valleys of the Vienna woods. 70,000 Christians had created a front along the hills. Finally, after weeks and weeks of marching across Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, they could place their eyes on the enemy forces below.
The Battle for Vienna was to start early. At 5 a.m, Ottoman forces opened fire. Charles, observing from the top of the Kahlenberg, sent troops to reinforce those who had come under fire.
The Ottomans pulled back to a defensive position, but then committed their entire force previously concealed behind a hill. The Allied troops were threatened with being enveloped on both sides. Charles was forced to deploy his entire left wing to avoid a serious setback.
At around 8 a.m, the combined Habsburg and Saxon forces halted their advance in order to bring the cannons forward. At this time, George Friedrich von Waldeck moved up with his troops alongside additional Saxon cavalry. After heavy fighting, the Kahlenberger Dorf fell to the Allied forces. The next target was the Nussberg.
Every meter, every fence, every wall was fought for. By midday, the Nussberg was captured by the Allies, and a small break in the fighting allowed the cannons to be pulled forward behind the infantry's new positions. The next point of attack for the left wing was Nussdorf itself.
As Kara Mustafa saw the danger unfolding, he ordered a large counterattack. Habsburg and Saxon troops were starting to falter. In the last minute, a unit of dragoons managed to reinforce the wavering Saxon infantry. In this fight, Prince Elector George III took an arrow to the cheek while fighting at the front of his bodyguard. More Saxon reserves pushed in, which marked a turning point in the battle. The Ottomans put up strong resistance in the vineyards and houses of Nussdorf. The left wing were able to, however, push all the way through.
The Ottomans were starting to lose their momentum. The longer the fighting lasted, the more they found themselves facing a fearsome, solid wall of advancing troops.
It was as if a flood of black tar was rolling downhill, crushing and burning everything that stood in its path. By 1 p.m, troops led by George Friedrich von Waldeck and a mixed cavalry unit had connected with the Saxon and Habsburg infantry in Heiligenstadt. The left wing and center of the Allied forces were now connected in a unified front. In the beginning of the afternoon, the Polish advanced over hilly terrain full of ditches, hedges and grapevines on the right wing. Against the Poles stood Abazar Sari Hussein Pasha. The Poles met light Ottoman resistance, but once the high ground was taken at around 2 p.m. and Polish infantry managed to drive the Janissaries out of Potsleindorf, the entire relief force was now in one continuous line.
Before Sobieski sent out a general order to charge, he sent out a rather pointless probing attack of around 150 hussars to charge the positions made up of thousands of Ottomans. A third of them died for no real reason.
After a quick break, Charles ordered to resume the attack against Ibrahim Pasha's troops and was able to advance to the Krottenbach. The Battle for Vienna was entering its deciding phase. At around 5 p.m, the Ottoman positions at the Türkenschanze were broken. Ibrahim Pasha fled the battlefield alongside many of his troops. The Ottoman forces were now wavering.
This gave the King of Poland the conviction needed to deliver a final blow with the entire might of his cavalry.
In the late afternoon, thousands of horsemen in colourful armour, flags waving high, lined up between the Galitzenberg and Dornbach. The elite Polish hussars, supported by Bavarian and Habsburg cavalry, some 20,000 riders, picked up speed and crushed into the remaining Ottoman forces in what is said to be the largest cavalry charge in history.
The enemy offered some resistance, but as the first Ottoman unit began to withdraw, they were soon followed by another and another and another.
Only a small force in the centre around Kara Mustafa continued to fight. Kara Mustafa himself wanted to fight to the death, but he was convinced otherwise and eventually gave the order to retreat. The Ottoman forces slaughtering a large amount of their prisoners while exiting the battlefield. In retaliation to this, around 3,000 captured Ottomans were to be burnt alive after the battle. While most of the Ottoman army had fled at this point, some of them were still holding out in their defensive structures just outside the city. An assault in the early evening was required to disperse them, and with that, the Ottomans were officially driven out of Vienna. At around 10 p.m, the last shot was fired. Darkness and quietness now fell over the area. Vienna was free. After 61 days, the siege was over. 20,000 of the Ottoman forces were either killed or taken prisoner on the 12th of September alone, the Allies losing just 2,000. For the Viennese, the losses were of course devastating. More than half of the defending fighters were dead, and an unknown number of citizens had perished either from the violence or from dysentery. Upon seeing the city, the Polish king Sobieski noted in a letter to his wife, "The human eye has never seen such things as those caused by the mines. From the masonry bastions, which are cruelly high and large, they made terrible rocks and ruined them so that they could no longer hold. The imperial palace is completely ruined by the cannonballs." On the 14th of September, 2 days after the siege ended, Emperor Leopold returned to Vienna by ship. For the first time, while he inspected the city, he got a grip on what his subjects had been through. He was particularly devastated when he saw the damage done to his beloved Leopoldtracht of the Hofburg. As the Ottomans fled back through Hungary, many of the Hungarian nobles who had previously let them pass without a fight now switched sides again. Count Baczany engaged some fleeing Ottomans in the hope that the emperor would soon forgive him. On the 18th of September, Allied forces departed Vienna and headed east. The battle for Vienna was over, but the battle for Hungary was about to begin. The Great Turkish War had begun. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed IV ordered the messenger that gave him the news of Vienna's defeat to be strangled. He then ordered the same fate on Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa. In Belgrade, on Christmas Day of 1683, or according to the Islamic calendar, the 6th day of the month of Muharram in the year 1095, Kara Mustafa was stripped of the banner of Muhammad, his imperial seal, and the keys to the Kaaba in Mecca. Upon hearing the news of his coming execution, as it was God's will, he asked that he simply be remembered in prayer. He voluntarily took his turban off. While the executioner was tying a noose around his neck, he regarded that it should be tied tight and correctly. In 2 or 3 quick tugs, he was strangled to death. His head was then severed and taken to the Sultan's palace as proof.
3 years after the siege of Vienna and after 1.5 centuries of Ottoman control, Buda was captured by the newly formed Holy League. The Allied armies went on to liberate most of Hungary, then the Habsburg pushed further south into the Balkans, getting as far as Skopje in what is today North Macedonia.
Mehmed IV was deposed by a group of janissaries, viziers and jurists and put under house arrest. Mehmed died of natural causes in 1687.
The wake of the Great Turkish War provided an expansive territory to fall under Habsburg control that would later be formed into part of the mighty Austrian Empire.
The war also led to the rise of the legendary Prince Eugene. Eugene had fought as part of the relief force in the Battle for Vienna. He would later become one of Austria's most famous and important military commanders in history. Despite still being a skillful military power, the Ottomans never fully recovered from the defeat at Vienna. It was clear that they had lost their century-long technological edge over Europe.
As an Australian, a big portion of my country's national identity has been built upon the Anzac defeat against the Ottoman Empire in Gallipoli 232 years after the Siege of Vienna. Although remembered as a tragedy, at the end of the day the Anzacs were committing an offensive. According to what I read in Mark Baer's book The Ottomans, the defeat in Vienna never really gained a memorial-like importance in the collective memories of the Ottoman Empire's own inhabitants. But of course the massive victory over the Ottomans became a tremendous story for the national identities of many European Christian states, and remains strongly represented in Austrian history today. But this kind of narrative forgets about the Hungarians who fought strongly as Ottoman vassals in an attempt to break free of the brutal Habsburg oppressors. In his book The Ottomans, Baer points out that at the Ottoman Military Museum in Istanbul, there are no 17th century Ottoman campaign tents to be found. To view them, one must go to the Museum of Military History in Vienna, where there is a permanent exhibition.
Thank you very much for watching. To support me and the channel, please consider subscribing, giving the video a like, commenting, and sending it to your friends. I look forward to making more.